The air in the courtroom was suffocating, thick with tension, the kind that made even the most seasoned attorneys shift uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone thought they knew how this trial would end. Officer Bradley Connors stood tall, his uniform crisp, his voice steady as he pointed an accusing finger across the room. I saw her break in with my own eyes. His words carried the weight of certainty, unshaken, smug. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, an easy smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. They had already won. The jury exchanged glances. Some nodded, some whispered. The case was simple, an open and shut conviction. And at the center of it all, sitting at the defendant's table, was Natalie Vaughn. She sat still, too still. She should have looked terrified, pleading, desperate, broken. Instead, she looked amused. There was no panic in her expression, no desperation in her eyes, just a quiet, chilling confidence. The judge cleared her throat, her tone carrying the weight of finality. "Ms. Vaughn, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Natalie finally moved. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, then rose from her seat, straightened her posture, locked eyes with Officer Connors. And then she dropped a bombshell. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "Officer Connors is lying under oath." The smirk on his face wavered. A flicker of unease flashed across the prosecutor's face. The jury leaned in, suddenly invested in what was about to unfold. Natalie took a single step forward. "And he doesn't even realize I'm a high-ranking Navy SEAL." The room erupted, gasps, whispers, murmurs of disbelief. The judge's gavel slammed against the wood. "Order in the court!" The prosecutor's smirk was gone, his face now set in a hard, unreadable mask. And Officer Connors? His fingers tightened at his sides, his shoulders stiffened, a bead of sweat traced down his temple. He knew he had just lied under oath against the wrong woman. The night air was cool, the quiet hum of the city settling as Natalie Vaughn left the gym, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She had just finished an intense workout, her body tired, but her mind sharp as ever. As she walked past a small convenience store, she noticed a young boy standing near the entrance, his small hands clenched into fists. He was nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting around. Natalie stopped. Something was wrong. She stepped closer, her voice calm. "You okay, kid?" The boy looked up at her, his face filled with hesitation. I lost my money," he whispered. "I was supposed to buy food for my little sister, but I dropped it somewhere, and I don't want to go inside without paying." Natalie's chest tightened. The kid looked terrified, not of getting in trouble, but of failing someone who depended on him. Without a second thought, she pulled out her wallet and handed him a few bills. "Go get what you need," she said with a small smile. His eyes lit up. "Really?" She nodded. "Yeah, take care of your sister, all right?" The boy rushed inside, grabbing a loaf of bread, some milk, and a few other small items. Natalie waited near the entrance, watching to make sure he was okay. The cashier rang up his items, smiling as the boy handed over the money proudly, like it was his own. Natalie felt something warm in her chest, the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from doing the right thing. And then, screech. A police cruiser skidded to a stop, its tires screeching against the pavement. Natalie turned just as Officer Bradley Connors stepped out, his expression already set in stone. He wasn't looking at the boy. He was looking straight at her. "Put your hands where I can see them," he barked, reaching for his cuffs. Natalie frowned, confused. "Excuse me? You think you can break into a store and just walk away?" Connors snapped. "We have security footage of a suspect in black gym clothes stealing from this store. You fit the description." Natalie stared at him. This was a joke, right? "I just paid for that kid's food," she said, motioning toward the boy, who was now standing frozen near the counter, his eyes wide with panic. "I didn't steal anything." But Connors didn't care. He grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. The kid rushed forward, his voice desperate. "She didn't do anything. She helped me. She's not a thief." Connors ignored him. Natalie felt a chill crawl up her spine. This wasn't just a mistake. It was something bigger. The courtroom was buzzing. The case seemed simple, a routine open and shut conviction against a so-called criminal. The prosecutor, Edward Langston, stood tall, adjusting his tie before stepping toward the jury with a smug certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a complicated case," he began, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "We have an eyewitness, an officer of the law, who saw the defendant breaking into a store. Security footage confirms a suspect in black athletic clothing. The pieces fit perfectly." He turned and pointed directly at Natalie Vaughn. "And that suspect is sitting right there." The jury watched her, waiting for a reaction. But Natalie didn't flinch. She remained still, composed, unshaken. The prosecutor paused, expecting fear, desperation, some kind of plea. He got nothing. Instead, the judge cleared her throat. "Ms. Vaughn, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Slowly, Natalie rose from her seat. Her posture changed instantly, straight, powerful, commanding. The prosecutor's confidence wavered. Something was off. Natalie's voice was calm but firm, carrying a weight that made the air in the room shift. "Your Honor," she began, locking eyes with the judge. "Before we continue, there's something the court should know about me." She turned her gaze to Officer Bradley Connors, whose smirk was fading fast. "I am not just an innocent woman falsely accused." She took a slow step forward. "I am a high-ranking Navy SEAL." The room froze. Gasps echoed through the gallery. The jury sat up straighter. The prosecutor's pen slipped from his fingers. Officer Connors' face went pale. The judge leaned forward, studying Natalie with new eyes. Everything had just changed. Natalie kept going. "I have spent years in classified operations. I have trained in high-pressure interrogations, and I can tell you, with absolute certainty." She turned back to Connors, her eyes sharp as a blade. "The man standing before you, wearing that badge, is lying under oath." The courtroom erupted. The chaos in the courtroom had barely settled when Natalie Vaughn took another step forward, her expression unreadable. The prosecutor, Edward Langston, cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Your Honor," he scoffed, trying to mask his unease. "Whether or not Ms. Vaughn has a military background is irrelevant. The evidence speaks for itself. An officer of the law saw her commit a crime. Case closed." Natalie's lips curled slightly, almost amused. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Langston," she said, reaching into her jacket pocket. "The evidence does speak for itself." She pulled out a small USB drive and held it up for the court to see. Officer Bradley Connors visibly stiffened. The prosecutor frowned. "What is that?" Natalie exhaled, her voice razor-sharp. "What Officer Connors didn't know is that I had my body cam running the entire time." The courtroom exploded into murmurs. The judge raised a brow, tapping her gavel for order. "Play the footage." The prosecutor hesitated, his jaw tight. He was losing control. A clerk retrieved the USB and connected it to the courtroom screen. A moment later, the truth unfolded before their eyes. The footage showed everything. Natalie walking up to the boy, him telling her he had lost his money, her buying him food, patting his shoulder, smiling gently, and then Officer Connors' cruiser screeching to a stop. His accusations, his refusal to listen to the boy's protests, the way he handcuffed Natalie without even asking a single question. Gasps swept through the courtroom. Officer Connors shifted in his seat, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. The prosecutor's face turned ghostly white. Natalie turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe that should be enough to prove my innocence." But then, something else appeared on the screen. Something even more shocking. a shadow lurking behind the store, barely visible in the dim streetlights. A man wearing a police badge, not Connors, someone else. The judge leaned forward. "Pause that video." The image froze. A second corrupt officer. The courtroom erupted into chaos once more. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Whispers turned into gasps, shock rippling through the jury, the gallery, and even the judge. Natalie Vaughn let the moment settle before she turned, slowly, deliberately, to face the judge. Her voice was calm but piercing. "Your Honor, Officer Connors isn't just lying, he's covering for someone." A dead silence fell over the room. Officer Connors' face drained of color. His fingers twitched, his breathing turned shallow. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Officer Connors," she said firmly, "is there something you'd like to tell this court?" Connors opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked trapped, cornered, and then, boom. The courtroom doors burst open. A group of men in dark suits stormed in, their movements precise, calculated. The air shifted. These weren't reporters. These weren't lawyers. These were the real masterminds behind the cover-up. One of them, a tall, bald man with a cold, calculating stare, locked eyes with Connors. And that was it. The moment Connors saw him, he panicked. His breath hitched, his hands clenched into fists, and then he bolted. Shoving past the prosecutor, knocking papers to the floor, he sprinted toward the exit. The courtroom erupted into chaos. "Officer Connors, stop!" the judge shouted, slamming her gavel down. But Connors was already gone, running like a man who knew his life depended on it. Natalie's jaw tightened. She knew one thing for sure. If Connors was running, it was because he knew something that could bring everything crashing down. And now, she was going to find out exactly what that was. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps, shouts, the judge's gavel hammering down, but none of it mattered. Bradley Connors was running. Natalie Vaughn's instincts kicked in instantly. Years of Navy SEAL training, of high-speed pursuits in enemy territory, of tracking down threats in the dead of night. This was second nature to her. Her chair clattered to the floor as she shot up, her eyes locked onto Connors, who was already pushing past reporters, shoving chairs aside as he sprinted toward the courthouse exit. He was fast, but she was faster. She took off after him, dodging people, maneuvering through the chaos. "Stop that man!" the judge yelled, but the security guards were too slow. Connor's breath was ragged, his hands fumbling as he shoved open a side door, bolting down the long, marble-floored hallway. He was headed for the emergency exit. Natalie pushed harder, legs burning as she closed the distance. Connors reached for the metal bar on the exit door. But before he could push through, Natalie lunged. Her body slammed into him, tackling him with full force. They hit the ground hard, Connors' breath leaving his body in a violent whoosh as he crashed against the cold floor. He thrashed, panicking, trying to shove her off. "Let me go!" he gasped, but it was useless. Natalie had him locked down in seconds. She twisted his arm behind his back, pressing a knee into his spine, holding him in place like it was nothing. Her breath steady, her voice calm but deadly. "You're not going anywhere." Connors froze. He had nowhere left to run. And now, it was time for the truth. 2 hours later, the bright interrogation room felt like a cage. Officer Bradley Connors sat slumped in his chair, his wrists cuffed to the metal table. His uniform was disheveled, his forehead glistening with sweat. Across from him, Natalie Vaughn sat perfectly still, unshaken, unmoved. Her eyes locked onto his, sharp as a blade. "Who are you covering for?" she demanded, her voice cold, calculated. Connors clenched his jaw, refusing to speak. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the only sound in the room. Natalie leaned forward. "You think staying silent will save you?" she asked, her tone low and edged with warning. "If you don't talk, they'll silence you next." Connors flinched. His fingers twitched, his breathing grew shallow. Natalie saw the cracks forming. She pressed harder. "You ran because you're afraid," she said. "You're in too deep, and you know it. But tell me this. Do you really think they'll let you walk away? Or do you think they'll make sure you disappear before you can say a word?" Connor's hands started trembling. His walls were breaking. Then he finally spoke. "The Black Vipers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Natalie stiffened. Her blood ran cold. She had heard that name before. A dangerous underground organization, corrupt officers, judges on payroll, high-level crimes swept under the rug. Natalie's fists tightened. This wasn't just about one dirty cop. This was something much, much bigger. The Black Vipers weren't just some street gang. They were something much worse. They were a machine, one that ran on drugs, corruption, and dirty money. And now, Natalie Vaughn was standing in their way. Across the interrogation table, Bradley Connor's face was pale, his eyes darting to the door like he expected someone to storm in and put a bullet in his head at any moment. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. His voice was hollow, almost a whisper. "They had my brother. They told me if I didn't do what they said, he'd disappear." Natalie leaned forward, her voice razor-sharp. "Where do I find them?" Connors hesitated. He looked terrified. But after a long moment, he swallowed hard and whispered, "Pier 19, Friday night, midnight." Natalie memorized the location. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The air was cold, thick with the salty scent of the harbor. The moon hung low, casting long, dark shadows over the shipping containers. Natalie moved like a ghost, slipping between crates, silent, unseen. She could hear them, the Black Vipers, talking in hushed voices. Weapons, money, corrupt officers. And then, her heart stopped. Standing among them, casually counting stacks of cash, was a police captain. Her stomach twisted. This went deeper than she thought. Then, clank. Her foot hit a loose wrench. The sound echoed in the silence. The conversation stopped. Heads snapped in her direction. "Who's there?" Natalie froze. Then, guns were drawn. They knew someone was watching. She had seconds to act. The pier exploded into chaos. Natalie Vaughn had seconds to act. The moment the first gun was raised, she moved. With silent precision, she grabbed the closest guard from behind, twisting his neck with one sharp motion. He collapsed without a sound. But the others? They weren't stupid. "Spread out!" a deep voice barked. "Find them!" Black Vipers fanned out, boots crunching on gravel, scanning the maze of shipping containers. Natalie slipped behind a stack of crates, heart pounding. She reached into her vest. Flash grenade. She pulled the pin, counted to 3, then hurled it into the center of the group. Boom! A blinding white light engulfed the pier, sending the men stumbling, shouting, cursing. Gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped through crates, splinters flying as Natalie ducked and rolled, weaving through the chaos. She fired back, precise, controlled. 1, 2. 3 men dropped before they even knew where she was. But she was outnumbered. She wouldn't win this by force. She needed an escape. Her eyes darted across the dock, searching. Then, she saw it. A cargo ship. It was leaving the harbor, her only way out. Natalie sprinted. Bullets whizzed past her head, the sound deafening. But she kept running. Closer, closer. The edge of the pier rushed up to meet her. Then, she leapt. The cold shock of water swallowed her whole. The current pulled her under, carrying her away. Above, the Black Vipers rushed to the edge, guns raised, searching. But she was already gone. Natalie Vaughn sat in the dimly lit safe house, her hands moving swiftly over the keyboard. The stolen burner phone from the Black Vipers had been encrypted, but she was trained for this. Trained to break codes, to uncover secrets that weren't meant to be found. Lines of text flashed across the screen, messages, transactions, names. Then, one name stood out. Her breath hitched. Senator Richard Kane. Her stomach twisted. A U.S. senator, one of the most powerful men in the country, was behind everything. The Black Vipers, The corrupt cops, the illegal arms deals, the cover-ups, everything led back to him. She leaned back in her chair, fingers tightening into fists. This wasn't just a case of dirty cops. This was a deep, sprawling network of corruption at the highest level. Before she could process it, her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she answered. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker. "We have your mother." Natalie's blood ran cold. Her grip on the phone tightened. A slow exhale. "If you touch her, you'll wish you hadn't." A low chuckle. "You want her back? Walk away. Drop the investigation, or you'll never see her again." The line went dead. Natalie sat there, the screen glowing in the darkness. Her mother's face flashed in her mind. This wasn't just about justice anymore. The war had just become personal. The warehouse was quiet. Too quiet. Natalie Vaughn crouched behind a rusted-out truck, her grip tight around her pistol. The moonlight seeped through the broken windows, casting eerie shadows over the stacks of crates and flickering overhead lights. She could see them, Kane's men, positioned around the room, weapons in hand, waiting. And at the center of it all, her mother, tied to a chair, bruised but alive. And standing beside her with his signature smug smirk was Senator Richard Kane. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said smoothly, adjusting the cuffs of his $1,000 suit. Natalie stepped out of the shadows, gun raised, eyes cold. "Let her go," Kane chuckled. "And give up my leverage? Come on, Vaughn. We both know how this works. You hand over the drive, and maybe I let her walk out of here." Natalie tilted her head. "No." Kane's smirk vanished. And then, chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded across the warehouse as Kane's men moved in, bullets ripping through crates, shattering glass. Natalie dove behind cover, returning fire with deadly precision. One by one, she took them down, her movements fast, methodical. A guard lunged at her from behind. She spun, elbowing him in the throat before taking him out with a single shot. Another tried to flank her. She grabbed a crowbar from the floor and slammed it into his knee, sending him crashing down. She was outnumbered, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Within minutes, the room fell silent. The bodies of Kane's men lay sprawled across the floor. Natalie turned. Only Kane was left standing, and he had a gun to her mother's head. "Put it down," he ordered, his voice deadly, "or she dies." Natalie froze, her hands steady. This wasn't just any man. This was a powerful, dangerous, corrupt politician, someone who had been untouchable for years, but not tonight. Then, her mother moved, a quick flick of her wrist, and suddenly, a pistol was in her hands. Bang! Kane's body jolted, his hand clutching his side as he stumbled backward, blood blooming across his expensive suit. His gun slipped from his grip. Natalie didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon, one shot, then another. Kane hit the ground, motionless. Natalie let out a breath, lowering her gun. Her mother looked at her, still holding the small pistol in her trembling hands. "You okay?" Natalie asked, stepping forward. Her mother let out a shaky laugh. "I am now." Kane was dead. The Black Vipers were finished, and justice had finally been served. The warehouse was still. The echoes of gunfire had faded, leaving only the distant wail of approaching sirens. Natalie Vaughn stood over Senator Richard Kane's lifeless body, her gun still warm in her hands. Her mother, shaken but alive, let out a breath of relief. And then, the doors burst open. FBI agents stormed in, their weapons raised, scanning the carnage before locking eyes on the real targets. Kane's remaining men, the corrupt officers, the enforcers of his criminal empire. One by one, they were hauled to their feet, wrists snapped into cuffs, their reign of terror ending in an instant. Natalie stood motionless, watching as Kane's once untouchable empire crumbled before her eyes. The man who had pulled strings from the shadows, silencing those who dared to expose him, was now nothing more than a headline. And what a headline it was. U.S. Senator tied to criminal syndicate, exposed. His dirty dealings splashed across every major news outlet. Arms trafficking, bribery, corruption at the highest level. There was no escaping it now. Natalie turned to her mother. For the first time in what felt like forever, she let out a breath that wasn't weighed down by the fear of who was watching, who was listening, who was waiting in the dark. Her mother pulled her into a tight embrace, whispering, "It's over." But as Natalie looked past the flashing lights, past the arrests, past the headlines, she knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Where are you watching from? Comment below, like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories. Because sometimes the truth is only the first battle.